Hello and happy Advent. That's right, that's Advent. Although my neighbors have had lights up for, well, the guy straight across the street has had them up for 2 weeks. And so, for some people, Advent started early. But we actually just put ours up last night because it was after Thanksgiving. I will say that having your lights up for that long does elongate the joy you get out of it. It's a pity to spend all that money and only get, a few weeks. I'm using my horn cup that my son gave me. Um, and I have plenty because it's Thanksgiving. It's a, horn of plenty. And if you want your own horn of plenty, I guess you'll just have to Google it because I'm not sure where he got it from. But here at the beginning of Advent, as I've mentioned, I think every time I've talked about Advent, it's the Latin word advenire means to come. O come, Emmanuel. There's a reason we sing that at the beginning of Advent, because it's where we're re-experiencing the journey, just like we finished the journey of the children of Israel receiving the promised land and receiving God's promise in that way, as circuitous as it was. Now we're going to talk about over just the short time that Advent is, the reality of people recognizing their need for God in the world, and they're calling out for God, and the march toward God fulfilling that time. And that would be when Paul talked about it, it was in the fullness of time. Now, I know I've said this before, but fullness of time in Greek is one word, kairos. Kairos. Not in Greek, of course, they use kappas and all that. But kairos meant fullness of time, because the Greeks had two different ways of talking about time. One was kairos, things would happen when they were right, and chronos, which is where we get chronology and chronometer and things like that. Chronos was just the sun coming up, the sun going down, marking off time so that you could say, I'll be at the party at 3 or whatever. And I came to appreciate that when I was reading a story that my dad wrote about his experience in Mexico in the 1940s. Because after the war, because he had the GI Bill money, he decided that it would go farther in Mexico. So he and my mom lit out for a place called San Miguel de Allende, and they had an art school, which is where he got his master's degree in art. And they went there, and he had there was a cook that was there. Although Mom did some cooking, they also, it was like 2 pesos a day, so they figured they could live high on the hog, and they had a cook. And then there was a handyman that would come around, and Dad befriended these as with his whatever kind of Spanish he had. Back then, I guess it was better back in the 40s. And he befriended their handyman, and he invited them to their villages, because he lived in a little village up from San Miguel. And to come to their posada, their Christmas Eve procession that they had, where they would walk around the square with a um, image of the Virgin in honor of the coming of Christmas. And so he, said okay. He didn't know what to expect, but he went up there, and the guy was referred to him as his patron, which was like a high-ranking guy. Of course, it was a impoverished art student, but he had more than 2 pesos to rub together, so that counted for being a patron. And they went to this place, and he said they were ushered to sit down and given a drink, and there they sat. And he said for, must have been 2 hours, people just seemed to mill around. Some people would talk to him, although in their limited Spanish, they didn't have a big conversation, but just nothing seemed to be happening. It wasn't like, it's not, whatever time, let's snap it up. It's back in the 40s, and none of those people had watches. And then finally, almost without any prior notification, everybody just started heading toward the door, and they motioned for Dad and Mom to come and head toward the door too. And it all started. Nobody said, hey, let's get going. Nobody checked their watch. Nobody said, hey, it's the X time to do it. It just happened because everybody was ready. And when everybody was ready, they just went out and did it. It wasn't based on Chronos. It was based on Kairos. It was based on everybody's ready. Everybody knows we're ready, and let's go do it. And they had their little posada and their procession. And Dad and Mom were rather entranced by that, and were very honored to have been asked to participate by this man that helped them out in their everyday lives. And it was it was a cool thing, but it was an example of the fact that God's time isn't our time, and that the timing is an issue of God knowing exactly when to bring the help. So that was the fullness of time that Paul was talking about. And so Psalm 80, and we'll read here now, is all about that beginning of the time period where you're expecting the Kairos to happen. Here it is. Give ear, O shepherd of Israel, that thou leadest Joseph like a flock. Thou that dwellest between the cherubim, shine forth. If you have the King James Version, here's a little, just a side note. In the King James, my King James at least, the modern translations take care of this. But in the King James, it said, thou that dwellest between the cherubims, shine forth. Cherubims having an S on the end. And that's because if you're going to be between them, there has to be more than one. So the translators took that word cherubim and pluralized it. Only apparently they either did it not knowing that I am at the end is the Hebrew way of pluralizing. So they took a plural word and pluralized it. So it would actually be cherubims, because a cherub is one, and a cherubim is more than one. So when they talk about the cherubim coming down, the host of cherubim, it's that's the plural. Like I said, if you have a more modern translation, none of them call it cherubims. But there's King James for you. Before Ephraim and Benjamin and Manasseh, stir up thy strength, and come and save us. Turn us again, O God, and cause thy face to shine, and we shall be saved. O Lord God of hosts, how long wilt thou be angry? against the prayer of thy people. Thou feedest them with the bread of tears, and givest them tears to drink in great measure. Thou makest us a strife unto our neighbors, and our enemies laugh among themselves. Turn us again, O God of hosts, and cause thy face to shine, and we shall be saved. And now verse 17. Let thy hand be upon the man of thy right hand, upon the Son of Man, whom thou madest strong for thyself. So will we not go back unto thee. Quicken us, and we will call upon thy name. Turn us again, O God of hosts. Cause thy face to shine, and we shall be saved. Cause thy face to shine, and we shall be saved. And you notice, aside from the repetition there, which I have mentioned time and time again, is the hallmark of Hebrew poetry, that it wasn't rhyme or meter, but it was either repetition or parallelism of thought. That cause thy face to shine, and we shall be saved. But you notice in between that, it sounds like, how long wilt thou be angry against thy prayer? Thou feedest them with the bread of tears. Thou givest them tears to drink in great measure. Thou makest us a strife unto our neighbors, and our enemies laugh among themselves. You see verse 6, that was the parallelism of thought there pretty clearly. Either saying the same thing twice in different ways, or saying one thing and then inverting it. But that they sound a little whiny. They're saying that things aren't great. Come and save us, please. Come and save us. Because when you make your face to shine, when you announce yourself in all your glory, it's taken care of. It's taken care of. And that's what they're asking for. And they're not being shy about recognizing the fact that they're not in a good way. Things aren't fine. Things aren't great. They need God's help as they pray this prayer. And they pray it knowing that God's the only one that has the ability to make a difference in their lives. They may have dug the hole for themselves, but it's about God being with them to change their fortune, to make that difference. And in that way, we recognize that we need God to do that for us. That the psalmist wasn't adverse to telling God exactly what things were like for them, and what about life right now they didn't like. And there was no sense of holding back, or of saying, well, we have to show some decorum. It wasn't about that at all. If you were in trouble, being honest about the trouble, being honest about your feelings about the trouble, was perfectly natural and normal and expected. And asking God to be the one to save you was the only thing that made sense to them. And they did. They asked for God's salvation. Now, at various times, especially in the Old Testament, you recognize that they asked for God's salvation in the context of, we're getting beaten up by the Philistines or the Amalekites, or whoever they are. Come and save us. And in Judges, it was about rising up a judge and going and beating up the people. Later in the kingdoms, it was about, you guys have dug the hole too deep, and it's time to have the house cleaned. And then there come the Babylonians, and things look pretty grim. And then they have, then they're asking God for God's favor. It takes on a whole different tenor. But that our salvation was never a matter of land. They could imagine that God's salvation was a matter of land. But you notice that the promised land was God's land of promise, because that's what he told Abraham. But it wasn't the end of their difficulties. Because what happened when they got to the promised land? They continued to sin and have a hard time. They didn't, that didn't solve all their problems, because how could it? They were still the same human beings. God recognized that what's going to make the difference in our lives, and what's going to bring in not the physical land kingdom here, what's going to make the difference is that our hearts are changed. This real estate right here is what God needs to change. And when God changes that, when that's made oriented toward God, then the miracles happen. Then the salvation comes. And, as I've mentioned time and time again, it's not just a matter of you and I being saved, finding that salvation. God's salvation in us is about the world being saved, being redeemed. You notice, maybe you did this when you were a kid. When I was at odd times when I needed some money. It was back in the day when you could redeem bottles for a nickel. And you'd go find a Coke bottle or a Pepsi bottle. And so I'd start scouring the neighborhood to see if anybody had thrown one out, or, find one on the side of the road and, get enough to buy my own Coke for a quarter, or even better, a candy bar. But I would redeem the bottles. And of course they would take the bottle, wash it off, and fill it back up. Redeeming meant getting the price paid for it. The bottle was as good a bottle as it ever was. Its status was changed by whose possession it was in. So our redemption is about filling us with the Holy Spirit. We look the same, just like the bottles did. But our redemption is about whose we belong to. And, we're God's. So the psalmist is recognizing that as we ask God for that redemption, we start recognizing the sad shape we're in, the sad shape we've made the world in, by not being God's people, collectively. And that the selfishness and the short-sightedness that can happen even among the household of faith are signs that we step back and once again call for God's filling within us, that we become God's people once again. God's people, not ours, our own. And in that way continue to build the kingdom. So the psalmist today, beginning of Advent, is talking about the beginning of the road, looking frankly at the the mess we're in, and talking honestly with God, and asking God to shine his face upon us, and in that way begin the trip of Advent. And there it is. Happy Advent to you. Thank you guys for your faithfulness. Wish I was there singing Come, O Come, Emmanuel with you in church. I hope that's what they'd have been singing. And love you guys. Keep up the good work. I love you, and talk to you later.